Today's episode is about emergent innovation.
Welcome to the Deliberate Creative Podcast, where we demystify the creative process, explain the research, and give practical advice and strategies to help you be more creative and build an innovative team. Now, here's creativity coach, team development trainer, and your host, Amy Clymer.
Welcome to the Deliberate Creative Podcast, episode 102. Today's episode is about emergent innovation, and I'm interviewing Dr. Johnathan Cromwell, who did a study that involved a startup that was making social robots. And in his study, he revealed this concept of emergent innovation, which at first seems like the complete opposite of deliberate innovation, but the more you understand it, you realize, oh wait, this actually can mesh really well. And because it gives us a deeper understanding of how innovation works, particularly in teams. So Johnathan's going to talk about his research and explain emergent innovation, and you'll get a chance to meet a social robot. Here's Johnathan. John, welcome to the Deliberate Creative Podcast. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here. I really appreciate being invited on.
Of course. Start off and tell us a little about yourself, about who you are and what you do.
So my name is Johnathan Cromwell. I'm currently an assistant professor at University of San Francisco. And the way I got here is I have an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering. And during my time there, I kind of realized that while many of my classmates were very focused on the technical aspects of the work and the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the math, which I liked at the time, I kind of realized that when applying it towards innovation, you really also had to understand the people and the social dynamics around the technology and innovation. Otherwise, if you don't understand that, you're much more likely to fail than succeed. So while most of my classmates thought that the idea was the most important part of any innovation, I thought that it was the people around the idea, cultivating the idea, developing that idea into something that's a final product that I thought was the most important. So as an undergrad, I pivoted towards wanting to understand that.
Which is that's not usual for an engineer.
No, they.
Cool.
I was ridiculed by all my friends pretty frequently. Yes, they made fun of me a lot for being interested in those things because they thought they were the soft skills. They thought that was the easy stuff. Alumni who would come back to campus would often say that was the most challenging part. So I started listening more to the alumni than to my contemporary classmates at the time. So, and now 10 years later, most of my classmates now understand that as well. So I pivoted back then and pursued a doctorate in management where I realized I could actually study those things pretty in depth. And have studied that basically been thinking about it, studying it for the last 10 years, and now do research and teach in areas related to that, which we're going to be talking about today on the podcast.
That's awesome. So let's jump into your research. Tell me, so in your study, well, you did multiple studies in your PhD dissertation, but you developed this counterpoint to an existing theory that basically is in some ways a premise of a big part of the work that I do in this podcast, that innovation should start by defining a problem. But you're suggesting not always. And so give us an overview of like this deliberate creativity or deliberate innovation versus emergent innovation.
Yeah, so the genesis of the idea and like where it originally came from is I wanted to study some situations where groups in particular would have to be trying to work to define the problem. Because when you read the literature now, yes, there's this heavy emphasis on defining the problem. And some people argue that it's the most important step of the process. If you've ever heard the quote, I think by Charles Kettering, a problem well defined is half solved. And that very much captures the sentiment that a lot of us believe and agree with. And so I didn't actually set out to find a counterpoint. I actually set out to just understand, well, what does it look like? What does that process of defining the problem look like? Because all innovation projects start with an unknown problem. And if the first step and the most important step is to define the problem, I thought maybe we should know more about how that process looks. Maybe are there things that are involved in defining the problem that are fundamentally different than the process of developing the solution? So that was my original interest, was trying to understand the difference between those two parts of the innovation process. So I was fortunate enough to find a local company who was developing a product that they were calling a social robot. And one of the most fortunate thing about this research project was that I was able to learn about this company very early on.
Nice.
So they had just recruited an executive team. They had just recruited their first set of employees and hadn't really started developing the product yet, or were at the very beginning stages. And so I thought that was a perfect opportunity to study these dynamics of defining the problem in action, because I thought that working on such a new technology where there's no existing industry around it, there's no existing category for it, that they would have to spend a lot of time defining the problem. So I thought it'd be a really rich environment to see those dynamics in action. And if I could get there early enough, then I would be able to have some comparison data between early stages of defining the problem and much later stages of developing the solution and finalizing that solution,
Nice.
which is what we already know lots about. So I went there studying this, expecting to find them to do that at the very beginning of the process. But that's not what they did at all. And they actually actively delayed the process of trying to define the overall problem for this particular product. And they eventually discovered something at the end that could be a really well-defined, constructed, coherent problem that solves a customer need. But it happened at the very end of the process rather than the very beginning. And so that was like the seed of the idea that became this particular paper you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so interesting. So tell us, before we get into more depth about what you found, tell us a little bit about the methodology. Like, you were there in person observing, but tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So really the method that you choose, I was pretty agnostic to the method when I first started my doctoral program. But what I was taught is that you want to choose a method that is appropriate to the type of research question you're asking and the level of knowledge or the level of theory that we have on that particular topic. So given that there was such little theory known about what is supposed to happen or how you define a problem well, given that there was such a huge it was kind of like a black box, that type of theoretical gap or knowledge gap calls for qualitative research, calls for you getting really in-depth, rich observational data if you can, but interview data, observational data, so that you can explore to see what happens. And what your goal is not necessarily to come up with a definitive answer of this is what a definitive answer to a research question. That's really more appropriate for quantitative methods, but really just to generate new constructs, new ideas, and new relationships between those constructs, and that could be suggested for future research that can later be tested through more quantitative methods. So it's a really generative process. And the method that I chose was qualitative work, where I did an actual ethnography of this company, attending their meetings. Basically, I basically acted as if I was a full-time employee there. I think on average, I spent about 4 days per week and maybe 30 to 35 hours per week at the company. They gave me, again, very fortunate that they gave me an email, access to the calendar, access to the Google Drive. I had free reign to attend any meeting that I thought was interesting.
Cool.
So I attended a lot of meetings, for more than 450, I think, in total, across 2 years. So from the very beginning to the very end.
Well, what do you think? I mean, that's so cool that they were willing to just be like, yeah, come on in, learn from us. What was their motivation for it? Was it just like, yeah, I want to support research, or was there something more to it?
So I had a close contact within the company who was hired amongst the executive team. And he is the one who I had asked if, I had learned that he had just been hired. And I said, wow, that sounds like I was at the time looking for a field site for my dissertation research. I was like, this sounds perfect. And I just kind of asked him what he thought about it. And he was very supportive right off the bat. And he's the one who, he introduced me to the CEO, the founder, the VP of product. So these are like the main decision makers in the company. And I told him what I was interested in doing and why I was interested in doing it, and what it would involve. And they deliberated on it for a week or so, but they ultimately decided that since I had so much support from this one person, he was the vice president of design at the time, because I had so much support from him, that they thought there's no harm, and allowed me, and maybe I could be useful. I also wasn't asking for a salary, which I think is pretty important from a startup perspective, that it's got limited cash.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you just needed some access, and that's super cool that they were open to that. And wow, like you put so much, 450 meetings.
There's also more than 2,000 pages of field notes, single space field notes across that time too.
When I was reading this section of your dissertation, I was thinking there's probably like years worth of data here that you could like continue pulling from this data.
Yeah, this is definitely like a career's worth of data that I am sitting on.
Nice.
Yeah. These papers are only like the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's awesome. So let's jump into this concept of emergent innovation that you found through the research. What did you notice in the research that led to this concept evolving?
Yeah, so the idea for the emergent innovation, actually, it took quite a while to get there after I started analyzing the data. And that's because the idea of the paper that I wanted to write was very different at the time of when I started that data analysis for that particular paper, and then like kind of during that analytical process where you're reading the data, you're checking against the literature, you're reading more data, you're coming up with your figure and your like what are the important constructs, and that iterative process. It's very normal for the kind of point of the paper, the purpose of the paper, to meander and change. So early on, I was interested in one topic, but it wasn't until later that I realized the particular process that I was observing, or that I was reading and noticing was happening. Mm-hmm. It was really this, what it gave me like the initial trigger on it was I noticed there was this kind of back and forth meandering between kind of looking at an existing prototype or an existing thing that had already been created, whether that was an Excel spreadsheet or a fully developed prototype. There's some sort of like reflection on what had just happened, and then some forecasting of like what we want to change and modify for the future. And it was like this constant back and forth. And that was like the first thing that led me down this path. And I noticed that particular back and forth was, when you build a whole model around it, actually has a very different experience than a traditional innovation process, where you do have this back and forth. But the real difference was that when they were reflecting on something that already had been produced, they were still interpreting what it was that a social robot was supposed to be and the problem. And that was the part that was constantly emerging over time and becoming more clear over time. And on most innovation projects, if the problem's already well known, the reflection is very different. It's mostly reflecting, okay, well, that's the current version of this. So that's the current prototype. What do we need to make better? Like, what are the pain points in the usability test? What are the ways to improve it? What are the ways to get around that? But the problem more or less stays the same. But in this case, it was very much both of those were emerging at the same time, co-emerging, co-evolving together. And that's when I kind of took a step back at the end of the analytical process and compared it to what we currently knew, is when I realized that there's some strong similarities, but also like these really deep fundamental differences that I think are really important to understand.
Absolutely. It feels like there's a couple things I want to comment on that. The first was that for you as a researcher, in order to get to this understanding about emergent innovation, you had to be really open of like, because, you have this idea of like, oh yeah, we should be defining the problem, but they're not doing that. And so you have to be open to interpreting the data and not, like forcing a certain lens on it.
Yes. So that is precisely what we do when we do inductive research.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was so excited about when having this finding was that, we have decades of work on creative process and innovation process that advocates for this problem-driven approach, which in the research world is deductive research. It's formulating a research question, and the more challenging and the more important that research question is, the higher likelihood you have to find a good answer and advance knowledge. And then you go and collect all the data that you can, broad search across theoretical frameworks, et cetera, to come up with your hypotheses, test them, and so we have the creative process that we advocate to companies and to people is identical, but it's analogous to the deductive process. And we have no counter answer to the inductive process, which we also, as researchers, know is extremely valuable and valid way of forming new knowledge. But we just don't have an analog counterpoint to recommend to other people on how to actually do that. So one of the reasons why I was so excited about these particular findings, because yes, I did discover this emergent innovation process through an emergent research inductive process. I wanted to include that in the title, and my advisor's like, it's too confusing.
That is, no one's going to understand that. Yeah. I mean, when I was reading your study, I was like, oh, you went through the same process you were observing.
Yes.
Which and, helped you actually,
sometimes you can't, you could critique that and say, oh, well, you're just kind of projecting something that onto this thing. So it could be just your own interpretation, which is completely valid. And which is why I'm saying that these findings are not definitive, but merely a starting point and a suggestion point for future research to further investigate and validate. But yeah, so I think the emergent innovation process is potentially a counterbalance to the very deductive approach that we recommend for creative thinking. This could be a complementary inductive process to help advance and develop new products and ideas, services, etc.
Yeah, I felt just on a personal level, like when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I can really see how this has happened in my life many times. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Foresight Thinking Profile. It's an assessment that measures your preference in the creative process, at least in the classic creative problem-solving process.
Can you send that to me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes for everybody.
Okay.
And there's an episode 8 of my podcast. Blair Miller, one of the creators of it, walks through it. But anyway, in it, there's the first stage is clarifying the problem, and clarify, ideate, develop, implement. And so some people are really high clarifiers. I'm not a high clarifier. So my tendency is to not spend a ton of time clarifying the problem. And in some ways I'm like, oh, sweet. I don't always have to.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. I think I think there are certainly people with different preferences for one or the other. And I think that this alternative process is very similar to kids just jumping in a playpen and starting to manipulate things and explore without necessarily knowing what they're doing or why they're doing it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you've alluded to, or I don't know if you've used this word yet, but you talk about in your dissertation is ambiguity. And a big part of this emergent innovation process is the ability to be comfortable with it, or at least okay with some ambiguity. So talk a little bit more about that, and also if someone struggles with ambiguity, how might...
Yeah, so the way that I think about this is that every innovation process starts with ambiguity on two dimensions. There's the ambiguity over the problem, and there's ambiguity over the solution. And the way that we typically recommend to overcome this ambiguity or confront it or tackle it is to first reduce it over the problem. And once that's clearly anchored and clearly defined, then you move on to reducing ambiguity over the solution. And in companies, the way that this normally happens is that the problem gets defined by some sort of strategy maker, maybe a manager, or maybe even higher up the organization. Maybe it comes straight from the vision and mission at the executive level. And that planning at that level trickles down into like lower level projects where it becomes very clear we're going to develop a new product that does blank, or we're going to develop a new product that counters blank in the market. And so that's, by the time it gets to the people actually developing the new products, problems are already pretty well defined. And then they can just iterate and they get the resources and the autonomy to develop the solution however they see fit. And that's a very comfortable way of organizing for innovation, and very common way of organizing for innovation. Now, what this emergent innovation process is suggesting is that you can actually embrace ambiguity over the problem, and that you actually need to in some cases, because it's not always possible to clarify your problem early on, particularly for breakthrough areas, new technology areas, new categories. Anything that's on like the leading edge is going to be more challenging to nail down that problem and get it right. So technology such as virtual reality, machine learning, blockchain, social robots, which is kind of like re-emerging as a category right now. So there's all these new technologies that have the potential for like real big change. And in those cases, like you can't know which problem is right yet. And so what do you do in those situations? Well, my argument is that you actually need to embrace the ambiguity over that problem, go into that uncharted territory and embrace it. But you can't embrace all the ambiguity. So what do? You need to anchor yourself on something. And rather than anchoring on some clearly defined problem, which is what we normally recommend, and that helps people feel like they're making progress towards a goal, what they can do instead is anchor on something related to their solution, whether it's the most interesting feature, whether it's the most patentable, protected feature or piece of their technology, something that, or they think that just their judgment that they think has the greatest potential to solve many different problems. And so the idea is to kind of invert the creative process on its head. And you need to be anchored on something that I think I firmly believe and found in the both in observations and kind of like my own personal experience. You got to anchor on something, but you can also anchor on some sort of tangible product, an idea, or feature or piece of the technology. Anchor on that, and then explore like how can that be expanded, and what is the range of different problems that this thing could solve. And I think that is a potentially very fruitful way of innovating, which is also, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it's potentially highly fruitful.
I love that concept of like anchoring on something. You've mentioned the social robot a couple times. Can you, can we back up and can you tell us what a social robot is, and maybe show us the one? I know you have a visual, but also talk about like, what did you find they were anchoring on?
Yeah, so I guess the best way to introduce or explain what a social robot is I think to just have it explain it for itself. So they gave all their employees one of their products, and they gave one to me too. So I actually did this during my dissertation as well.
That's awesome. Let's see.
So this is the social robot, and some of your viewers probably recognize it. So I'll say, hey, what are you?
Bo is a robot, but I'm not just a machine. I have a heart. Well, not a real heart, but feelings. Well, not human feelings. You know what I mean?
That's awesome. And so what's the value of, like, for a human?
So this is what they wrestled with for 18 months. And, they thought it had lots of value in lots of different ways early on. And then through these 3 stages of development that I document in the paper, they started anchoring on they started realizing, okay, what was like the value that actually people were most excited about. And the early on, they thought, well, I guess the two big stages is that at the early on they thought, well, we're not really sure what a social robot's supposed to do and what value it's supposed to be bringing to people. So we're going to just like delay that decision until later. Like, we know there's a bunch of features we want to create, and let's just figure out what those features are. Like, let's nail those features, and then we'll figure out how to kind of integrate it all together. And it's about 10 months later, 11 months later, where they realized, like, well, we actually have a deadline and we can't develop all the features. So typical engineering project, time, budget, features, and pick two. So they had to start narrowing their feature set, at which point they started realizing, well, we need to figure out like what is the thing it's supposed to be, so that we can choose the right features and prioritize the features. And during that first stage, so during this really intense 3-week period, that first stage, they started, they anchored on something that I personally wrote in my notes that I found very inspirational, which was, they wanted to counter this trend going on that they saw in the world, where people were using technology and they were using social media technology, and they were becoming less socially aware, because technologies don't do anything. They just sit there and we are glued to them, and we lose our ability to kind of have emotional intelligence by doing that more. And not so much maybe for adults, but for children who start at a very young age with that habit, are not, their emotional intelligence and social intelligence it's not getting exercised at a young age. So it gets stunted. So there's that. And then also we were lonely. So by using social media and getting connected to more people, we were actually getting lonelier and more depressed. And so they wanted to counter that with this technology and saying, well, this technology not only exercises your social intelligence because it moves and behaves in ways based on research that we know we respond to. Like, there are certain cues that we know, oh, this is a social being, and we interacted with it in a more social way. So it was exercising social intelligence, and it had the potential to make us less lonely. So they wanted to make it a family facilitator. So something that, instead of helping you access a broader network of more diffuse connections, they wanted to help this technology create stronger connections with an intimate family network.
That's really cool.
And that was like the vision that they landed on. And I remember thinking, like, yeah, that sounds great. Like, let's do it. And so they worked on that for about 8 months, and then they finally got a full stage product, prototype that was functioning, and they put it in people's homes. And this was a small scale usability test, and kind of like friends and family. And they were getting the feedback, and the families were just like, no, this is not bringing the family together. Like, our kids we're trying to have dinner as a family and have discussions, and the kids just want to go play with a robot, and they're like totally distracted because the kids love the thing. And that was like a huge letdown. It's like, oh, nice vision, nice problem, but big swing and a miss in this case. And you can't really know that until you have the prototype developed and it's out there. So this triggered another really deep reflection period within the company. And during this process, they also were getting feedback and realizing, oh, well, there's something about the product that's really resonating. And it's this feeling of the character, this feeling of and people were talking about, like, with the potential for companionship. At least a dimension of the product was this almost living thing in your home. It was like having a pet, but without having, all the hassles of pets. You don't have to take the robot for a walk.
Right.
So they noticed that was coming through really strongly, but the usefulness dimension was really lacking. And so then they pivoted and realized, well, we can actually make this product they eventually fused those two things together. That really represents, like, the name of it, social robot. So robot is really a useful device things like an assistant for you. And a social thing is like a friend or a companion. So the way that they fuse those concepts together, instead of thinking of them as like, well, let's do this and that, like in parallel, they thought, well, we need to do those together and say, well, we need to achieve assistant-like objectives, but deliver it in a companion-rich, personality, character-rich way. And that was going to help it differentiate from other products on the market, such as an Alexa or a Google Home, which at that point had become quite popular and also quite cheap. So the ultimate, the value proposition was, doing things similar to Alexa, but doing it in a much richer, interesting, character-rich way that was like having a pet robot in your home.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
You answered one of my questions, like how would this differ from Alexa or Siri? And so that's awesome. Tell us, okay, so let's go back to Emergent Innovation. And I think I just have one more question before we close, but what would you say are the elements of Emergent Innovation? Are there certain things that we should know? Emergent Innovation.
Yeah, I think the most, so it has many elements that are similar to like the traditional innovation process that your viewers are probably very familiar with. Generating ideas, prototyping, iterating, and repeating like over and over and over again, and getting user feedback. All these things are like essential elements of it. The really core difference, like the most important difference, is that when you're looking at prototypes and evaluating ideas, in the traditional process, you're evaluating things to determine whether they're good or bad, and whether they should be included or excluded. And this assumes that when you're evaluating something, you evaluate it against some existing understanding of a problem. That's the only way you can evaluate if something is good or bad, is that, well, is it solving the problem or is it not solving the problem? If it is solving the problem or getting you closer, well, it's good and you include it and continue developing it. If it's bad, you disclude it. But in emergent innovation, you're not evaluating. You have to interpret. And that's the key difference, is interpreting ideas, interpreting prototypes. And what that means is that you're interpreting, what could this be? What types of things could this be solving? And so that's part of the embracing the ambiguity early on, is saying, well, we're not going to anchor ourselves onto any particular problem. You have an idea of what the problem is supposed to be. You have an idea what the problem is supposed to be. We're going to say any of those are possible, and anchor on your prototype. Is okay, well, given the state of the prototype, given the state of the features, given the state of development of the product, what are the most likely things that we could do? And what are the things that maybe we didn't think about before that could be done? And so this interpretation process allows you to embrace that ambiguity of the problem and be comfortable in exploring it, but also eventually reducing it and constructing your problem. But if it goes wrong, you can pivot. So it's like this constant meandering and pivoting process on the problem while the solution is getting more and more developed.
Yeah.
And eventually those two things will, like, the more developed your solution gets and your prototype gets, the easier it is to see what problems this thing can and should be solving. So that's the really big difference. Interpreting versus evaluating, and understanding that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And if you notice everyone in the room is is disagreeing and getting into a fight about, are these good or bad ideas, good or bad features, recognize that that's what's happening, is everyone's evaluating against their own internal embedded problem, and just accept that and kind of flip it and embrace that and say, okay, well, all these could be right. Let's now construct a problem together.
Yeah, I love it. It makes me think about so many inventions or discoveries that we have. I mean, the first thing that came to mind when you were talking about it was Post-it notes, where it was like, oh, we have this solution before we have a problem. We have this glue that is like easily removable, barely sticks. The person who created it was trying to actually solve a completely different problem. And then he discovered this glue that he made, like, oh. And then that
so the Post-it note is a very famous example. There's the microwave, and I can't remember them all.
Yeah, there's so
many.
But
there's a paper that came out in 2017 that I think is really, I mean, it should turn your head and make you rethink what you know about innovation, because this paper was studying something that they called exaptation. So this is a paper written by an author, Andriani et al., 2017, paper in Organization Science. And they actually, they are studying technological change across industries, across decades. And there's a literature that studies innovation at that level. And they had come up with this idea a few years ago of what they called exaptation. And this is different than adaptation. So adaptation in the concept of evolution is you have some need, and a species adapts and develops a new feature or like a new version of the feature to meet that need, and then outcompetes the rest. Exaptation happens when an existing feature gets what they call exapted. I don't like the name, but that's what they call it, exapted, to solve a new function,
Cool.
or to solve a new purpose. So feathers, for example, is like the very famous example of an exapted feature. Feathers did not evolve to help birds fly. They evolved to help birds stay warm.
Oh, interesting.
It was only once they evolved, once those things existed, feathers existed, then some birds started using the feathers to fly, and that became a selective advantage. So that's like an example of exaptation. And so they noticed that this pattern of evolution also happens with technologies and innovations. So anyways, all this to say is that this paper decided to measure these things, measure these two different versions of innovation, which map very well to what I'm calling deliberate or purposeful creativity and emergent creativity, emergent innovation. Measure the two things and see how often do they happen. So they took all the innovations in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States from like 2000 to 2008. And they looked at, okay, what were the origins of those pharmaceutical drugs, and how did they come to be? And they found that of all, it was like, I think it was around, I can't remember, it was maybe 150 or in the hundreds of drugs, 42% of them came from this emergent exaptation process.
Nice. That's cool.
So that's almost half.
Yeah.
And then they said, okay, well, let's look at the top breakthroughs, the ones that really made money in the industry, like the top 10%, top 5% money makers. What's the breakdown there? And it jumped from 42% to 95%. So this is potentially suggesting that the way that we teach creativity and the way that we teach how to do innovation within groups, as individuals, not only accounts for only half of all the innovative activities that are happening, but accounts for only 5% of the breakthroughs. So to me, that like really illustrates the potential for this emergent innovation process. And really, we need to understand it and learn how to do it better. Because I think the potential is huge. It's clearly already happening out there. And we need to figure out how to understand it and harness it more effectively.
Yeah, because I think when we can understand it, then we can be more deliberate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, John, one of the things I like to do at the end of each episode is give listeners a weekly challenge. So what is something that listeners could do to begin applying what they learned today from you?
Yes. I'm very excited to answer this question because this is something that I do to challenge myself to be more emergent. And I do it probably 3 to 4 times a week, is cooking. So when you're cooking, you could either make a recipe that you already know, or maybe you could improvise on that recipe and go buy your ingredients and execute. Or you could do the emergent approach, which is you can do improv cooking. You can start with what's in your fridge, start with some random ingredients in your pantry, and use those as starting points to come up with a dish on the fly. And what this process is exercising is exactly what emergent innovation is all about, which is anchoring on your resources, anchoring on your features, in this case, ingredients, and then using those ingredients to shape your problem, to shape your recipe, to shape the dish that you're going to create. And I think this is a very simple way that people probably already do at home.
Yeah.
To really exercise and embrace that. Well, I don't know what I'm going to make, but let's find out. And it's a way you can do it, multiple times a week, and it's quite fun and hopefully delicious at the end. So
yeah, that's awesome. I love it. John, how can people find you if they want to connect?
Yes, I mean, I would just recommend people to reach out to me directly. They can my website on my faculty profile at USF. I think has my email, but I'm sure you will include that in the show notes as well. I also have a website that's kind of in the early stages of development called Dynamino. So it stands for Dynamic Innovation, which is really understanding not only emergent innovation, but also the dynamic movement between these two different innovation processes. And that's early stages. I'm still only in my second year as a faculty member and have lots more questions than answers around these processes. But hopefully, developing more research all the time to understand them better, and that's kind of like is my outlet for translating these things into practitioners' work that they can actually use. And also, if anyone's interested in participating in research, I'm developing survey metrics to kind of start measuring these things in the future, and whether they're preferences or the environments that people are operating in, and trying to find alignment between those things. Probably very similar to what you are doing with deliberate creative process on your all the work that you've done with developing a survey. I hope to do similar stuff. So if people want to participate in research, that's another thing they can do.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Well, John, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's really cool to hear your research, and I'm excited to see what else you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks again for the opportunity to come on here and share it with you and your audience. This is really exciting for me. So I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Such good stuff from Johnathan. Johnathan, thank you so much for being on the show. If you would like to get the resources that Johnathan mentioned, that anything that came up in the podcast episode, you can go to the show notes, and you can find that at climerconsulting.com/102, because this is episode 102. And Climer is spelled CLIMER. So climerconsulting.com. The other thing you'll find there is you have the opportunity to sign up for an email list. I send out emails about like once a month, and I write articles around innovation teams, leadership, to help your team be more innovative. So if that interests you, you can sign up there. And I have something coming up this spring. I'm doing a few free webinars around different elements of innovation. So if you're interested in those, the best way to find out about them is via email. So you'll get those if you're on that list. I'll also be announcing them on social media. So if you're interested in connecting on social media, my LinkedIn handle is Amy Climer. You'll find me there. Same with Twitter. And on Facebook, I'm at Climer Consulting. So we'd love to connect with you on social media. And if you have questions about innovation or teams, feel free to shoot me a note or send me a message on any of the social media platforms, because I may be able to incorporate your question into a future podcast episode. Or if it makes more sense, we can jump on a phone call and talk further about your situation and your organization. All right, y'all, have a wonderful creative week. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Deliberate Creative Podcast. Listen to more episodes and learn more about creativity, leadership, and teams at climerconsulting.com.